Well, welcome to the Good Troublemakers. And I'm so happy today. I'm Paki Wieland, the host, and I am so happy today to have two amazing guests, two young troublemakers, Joe Rosen and Eve Glazier. And one of the themes I thought about when I was thinking about this program was money talks. And we're going to be talking about divestment. And you know, oftentimes what people know about is how to do investments, how to make money in this capitalist society. And I thought it would be very interesting for us to really do a kind of educational for folks who don't know a lot about divestment. You know, you'll hear about it, but what does it mean? And it's, oh, well, never mind, I'll talk about something else. So I thought, you're both involved with the divestment, you with your college, and you with the city, and the overlap and crossover. So maybe we could start with, what does this mean? What is divestment anyway? Divestment of what, from what, by whom?
Great, yeah. So divestment is it's a pretty expansive concept. I think the way that we're thinking about it really is that it's a tactic that in this moment, particularly where we are in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, where we, you know, have been going so hard in this movement, you know, for almost 2 years, and for many of us way, way longer than that, since October 7th and the following genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. We've seen the largest mass movement standing up for the Palestinian freedom struggle that we've ever seen. More people than ever going out in the streets, demanding a ceasefire, demanding an arms embargo, demanding a free Palestine. So many people who, you know, were once held a Zionist position are now coming around to understand the need to fight for Palestinian rights and freedom and liberation. And just this dramatic cultural paradigm shift in the way that we're thinking about Palestine collectively in our conscience. And yet we see very little actual material change in terms of the situation in Gaza and the situation in Palestine. If anything, things are getting worse on the ground in Gaza. A horrible famine, and Yahu's saying it's going to be the final solution and he's going to get all Palestinians out of Gaza. So it leaves us with this question of, like, how do we reconcile these things? Why, if our movement is growing and growing and growing in numbers, do we still see such little material change? And the answer, partially, there's so many answers, but partially the answer, I think, is because there's this, you know, deep industry of corporations and banks and capital that are so deeply invested and reliant on upholding this genocide, upholding occupation, upholding the military-industrial complex. So many people are making money off of this. There's so much material financial resource and so many wealthy people in power that are just benefiting tremendously from the horrors that we're seeing in Palestine and in so many other marginalized places in the world. And so when I think about divestment, I think about how do we actually get to the core of what are the forces that are allowing such atrocities to take place in the world. It's because we live in this capitalist society. It's because we live in this military-industrial complex where it's established to benefit. And so thinking about, so divestment, to get to the point, divestment to me is a tactic that really allows us to get at the material sources of oppression. How do we actually get these corporations to listen to us? They don't actually care that we've changed people's minds unless it gets at their bottom line. So how do we get to their bottom line? We take our money out of these corporations. We take our money out of Israel bonds. We actually start to threaten the pocketbooks of all of these entities that are profiting off of genocide and oppression in Palestine and globally. And so this to me is why divestment feels like such a crucial tactic in this moment. And I don't know if that was so helpful about the mechanics of what divestment actually is, but to me that feels like useful framing for like why Joe and I feel like this particular campaign, for me to get Northampton to divest from companies that are complicit in the genocide in Palestine, or for us to get our universities to divest from companies complicit in the genocide in Palestine, why that feels so important right now, especially in this moment.
Well, you've given a beautiful rationale for divestment. I mean, it was quite succinct and right on target. So we've got the rationale, and you mentioned one of the cities that you're talking about, and that's Northampton, Massachusetts, and so I'm curious whether we want to follow up with that or go on to so that's one of the areas, the municipalities, but there's also colleges and universities, and you're an alum of one of our local colleges, and do you want to say something about that and divestment related to what he's been talking about?
Sure, yeah. So thank you for having me. I'm honored to be part of this conversation with both of you. And Eve's talking about the economic pressure that we can bring to bear, in this case, through a municipality. So we're trying to do the same thing with Smith College as an institution that has its endowment invested in ways that we think are not in line with its values. So we're a group of alums trying to put pressure on the college in line with the students' demands that they put forward, really starting in the fall of 2023, to the administration to divest from any weapons manufacturers and war profiteers. And different schools have approached it in different ways, and we can talk a little bit more broadly about divestment in these sort of different contexts, municipal, institutional, and also about the Smith campaign in particular. So
maybe we should start with that, with the Smith campaign in particular. I remember, just as a little background, some years ago, students and alum said we want to divest from fossil fuels.
Yes.
And that was a successful campaign, as I understand it.
Yes.
So you have a precedent.
Yes.
Yes.
And even before that, Smith in the 80s did divest from South African apartheid. Right. So we have a couple of precedents to look at, that Smith can make these changes to how its endowment is invested and sort of update where it's profiting in a way that sustains the college, but also is more in line with its values.
Yeah. And I think this is really important. I'll just point it for a moment, and that is, you're talking about divestment, but we're also talking about investment.
Yes.
So you're not saying we want you to become Franciscan monks, but rather we'd like you to invest in things that are for the common good. But so I hope our viewers will hold that too. But so let's go on to what's your tactic, to use Eve's phrase, for getting your college to divest.
Yeah, so in Smith's case, they responded to a proposal from the students. I believe it was on its third iteration by March of 2024. And they said that they were not going to accept their proposal for divestment. And in response, the students occupied College Hall. There were about 50 of them, and they were in there for almost 2 weeks. And it was before the encampments in other places had really escalated. And luckily, Smith did not have the same level of police crackdown that we saw at UMass and other schools. But they also didn't meet the students' demands. And it was during that time that the alumni really started to get involved, first writing letters and gathering on campus. And since then, mostly we've been focused on building support. So we have few opportunities to connect with each other, but on campus during graduation and reunion is an important time. And online, we've done a watch party of a divestment webinar put on by the American Friends Service Committee, and used that kind of as a discussion tool for how we want to approach our campaign with the administration. And our focus so far has been on a campaign to get alumni to pledge to not donate until Smith divests. And we're trying to figure out if that's enough or if there's more that we can do to create an alternative fund or some way to show them how much money they're missing. We have over 800 alum who have signed on so far, and we're hoping to increase that. And we're finally getting a little bit of an opening from the administration to have a conversation with us. And so we'll see where we go from here, but we are hopeful. In Smith's case, it's a very small percentage of their endowment that is actually invested in what they call indirect investments. And so they've tried to use the excuse that their investments are negligible. But these exchange-traded funds that include weapons manufacturers could really make a big difference, if not materially, like Eve was talking about, given the amount of money, but really symbolically to lead the way that other institutions and municipalities can do the same thing. And cumulatively, it can have a much bigger material impact.
Dare I use the word morally?
Yes.
That, in keeping with the mission of your college, that it's a stand, and I'm using it, and almost with tongue in cheek, but right now there's so many things. Morality is not particularly appreciated in the mainstream, it seems. So I think it is important to raise that as an issue. I'm curious about how the alumni and the students are working together, and how you're doing that.
Yeah, so we've tried to identify liaisons to be in touch with each other, and it is a challenge. I think that it's one of the things that the colleges count on, actually, is that as students graduate and there's turnover, it's hard to sustain these campaigns. And so that's one thing that alumni can bring, is this continuity. We're not going anywhere, we're still alumni.
And when you graduate, you will become.
Yes, exactly. So each year we can have more people joining the alumni group. And we have a particular pressure point, I think, in withholding our donations, because that's primarily what the college wants from us once we're alumni.
Yes.
So we try to be in touch with the students and follow their lead and their requests, and they are in a moment of transition themselves, trying to figure out how next year's class is going to carry on. So we'll see how we can maintain the communication better moving forward.
Yeah. I just want to note this, that I've seen, we've seen on many campuses everything from encampments to various other protests, but I haven't heard much about alumni in other schools, and I'm curious about how, if you know of that happening in other places, and the power of, I was thinking about the alumni, and you said, 800 people have signed, and I think, okay, money talks. Is it still just a whisper, or is it becoming more amplified?
Yes, we definitely need to get more significant donors, probably, to get Smith's attention more. A lot of the people who have signed are more recent graduates, so they're less likely to have as much to donate at this point. But the colleges also really want you to start donating right away to get in the habit to be regular donors moving forward. So, it works both ways. There are alumni groups at other colleges, and we've tried to reach out and learn from them. It's been a little challenging, but I do have a call next week set up with someone from University of Chicago, and try to learn from what their alumni group is doing.
I can add to that as well. I went to Barnard, so I'm an alum of the Columbia and Barnard SJP, JVP chapters, which has been quite an experience,
I would say,
these past years. But right back in the fall of 2023, before the encampments, before things really blew up, Columbia suspended the Students for Justice in Palestine chapter and the Jewish Voice for Peace chapter, both of which were very meaningful and important to my time there. So what happened was all of the alumni of SJP and JVP immediately got together, connected from all places over the world, had some Zoom calls, and planned an action a couple weeks later where we all took our caps and gowns that we got at Columbia graduation, and we gathered at the Columbia gates, and we did this big thing where we threw our caps and gowns back over the gate to say, we don't want these anymore. We're not interested in being connected or in continuing to support an institution that is not supporting the organizing that was so important to us. And it was such a beautiful just like reunion of all of these people who I had learned so much from, and who really were the people from whom I learned how to organize and what it means to be part of the Palestine solidarity struggle. And then after that, the alumni of Columbia and Barnard continued to be really on the front lines doing encampment support. I knew so many people who threw down whatever they were doing when the Columbia encampment started, and were bringing food deliveries back and forth, and we're giving students who were evicted from their dorms places to stay. And I'm really impressed that the Smith alumni organizing has really kept up that organizing infrastructure.
So you've moved from the college campus to the university campus to the city to looking at municipalities. And so you've got this good background of organizing. And so how are you putting that into practice?
Yeah, it's certainly been a lot of learning, because so much of what I knew about divestment was from that campus context. But I think a lot of it has been transferable. Definitely just knowing the importance of divestment and what it means. And I think that's one of the really cool things about divestment as a tactic, is it really can apply to whatever institutions or cities or places we're a part of and connected to at that moment. So whatever you feel like is a space that you have a particular position of influence to compel them to divest, you can call for them to divest. So for me, I live in the city of Northampton now. I feel like I have some political say there by just being a resident of the place, but maybe it's that I'm part of a religious organization, or maybe I'm part of a school, or maybe I'm part of another group that has money invested somewhere. And so it can really be this beautiful constellation of all kinds of different organizations coming together collectively to form this really powerful thing. So you can really do it from wherever you're at, which is why it's been great to transfer from the university context to now this municipal context, where it's been similar in some ways and different in other ways. I think different in the sense that cities are supposed to be democracies, so you can do a FOIA request and actually find out what we're invested in, whereas with a private university, it's much harder to do because they don't have an obligation to reveal what they're invested in. So that's been interesting. It's figuring out that whole research end of it, and how do we use our legal rights to access information to be able to find out what our city is actually invested in, and that's been one new learning. And also, of course, it's just a much, in a lot of ways, bigger and more diverse base to build. Campus is a fairly contained environment that has a lot of people of the same age, and different structures for community organization. So it's been really cool to organize in more of a municipal context where.
And your position in the college or university is temporary, but in the city where you're now a resident, this is home. It may be temporary too, but for the moment, and with the other neighbors, you're part of what is purported to be a democratic institution, and so you're exercising that, which is, I think, so important. So how are you doing it?
Yeah, so it all started probably almost a year ago now. I think a group of folks came together last summer to really start looking into municipal divestment against corporations that are actively perpetuating genocide in Palestine last summer. And it was this coalition of folks from various groups in the Palestine Solidarity social justice organizing ecosystem in the Valley. So I'm a member of Jewish Voice for Peace, as is Joe, so I was involved in organizing. From that standpoint, there are folks in our group from DSA, from Demilitarized Western Mass, from various organizations who are doing peace and justice work. Some people who have histories in environmental organizing. What's actually been really cool is that there are people who are part of our group who are really involved in the movements to divest from fossil fuels on their campuses and in their cities. And so we have that precedent and that knowledge gained from what it actually means to do a successful divest movement. Of course, the conditions of divesting from Israeli apartheid are a bit different than fossil fuels, but it's just been cool to see the lineages of those divestment struggles continue in this way. So we came together in this coalition and we started, the first step was really looking at what are we invested in. And so we started looking at the pension funds, and we started contacting various elected officials and municipal employees in the city to try and find out what are our investments. Are we invested in these companies that are identified to be the most acute perpetrators of occupation, apartheid, and genocide in Palestine? So we did some of that research. We connected with groups like the American Friends Service Committee, which is one of the organizations that's really at the center of the national and international movement for divestment and maintains a list of corporations that they've identified as the most actively involved. And so we started learning from them and started learning from people who in other cities have had successful or ongoing campaigns for divestment from Palestinian apartheid in their localities. And so really started that learning process. And basically since then we've been working on both writing the legislation that we want the city to pass. So we've been working on drafting language for a divestment resolution, and simultaneously kind of mobilizing the base of people who can give us enough people power to actually get this to pass.
Now, let me ask you, first of all, for our viewers, I want you to be aware of two things. I want you to be aware of the importance of AFSC, of the American Friends Service Committee. If you're in your city or town or interested in working for divestment, to follow up on that. But the other thing that I'm curious about, because I for years worked on divestment during the Iraq War. And one of the things I found in Northampton and in other cities is that each city is not autonomously investing in its pension plans, but there's a Commonwealth-wide, and not including every city or municipality, but many. And so I'm curious. So it's not as though we could go to the mayor of Greenfield, for example, and city council and say, we want you to do this, and they have the power to do it, or to say no, but certainly the power to do it. That does not seem to be the case, and I'm curious if that's been your experience, and if so, how you're moving forward beyond that.
Yeah, honestly, it's been quite difficult to get a grasp of all of this financial investment, the different pools of money, who is in charge of doing what, who has the power to do what. I think in Northampton, especially, I don't know about Northampton especially, but in Northampton, it all feels very fuzzy, and everybody we talk to has like different perspectives, and the city officials are like, yeah, we don't quite understand how this all works either. So ultimately we were able to get a list of the city's investments.
So when the city people say, we don't know either, how does that touch your confidence in them?
In some ways it's like, frustrating that, because there's not a lot of clarity, it's hard to, develop a clear path to victory. But on the other hand, it's like, okay, well, if this is all just a bit confusing and unprecedented, then maybe that actually gives us more ground to chart some new territory and do something bold and pass something that is just like in line with our values and not so in the weeds of all of these different financial policies. So I think, we've tried not to get too bogged down in all of the confusing little financial details, because I think that's how our movements get contained and subdued, is getting too in the weeds about all of these different policies that are actually, I think, intentionally designed to be confusing, because they don't want organizing groups to necessarily be able to navigate these things, because it's like easy to get discouraged in the work. And so we've been just trying to stay the course, know what we're trying to do, which is get the city to both divest from whatever holdings it has, which we know there are some small pools of indirect investments that it has in some of the companies that the American Friends Service Committee identifies as actively perpetuating apartheid. So we want the city to divest from whatever it is holding, and a big piece of it is to commit to not investing in these things in the future, because whether or not they have a lot of holdings right now, they could tomorrow or the next day be like, oh, let's buy up a lot of Israel bonds, or let's invest in this company, whether or not they're actively making that decision, or it happens at the, from some portfolio financial manager that they're investing in and don't realizing it. We really want that commitment from them to be like, we are not going to invest in these things in the future going forward. So all in all, it's a little tricky to navigate, but I think our morals are clear and our principles are clear and our demands are clear. So we're trying to just,
It's interesting as I'm listening to you and thinking about your experience at Smith, that you can say, well, Smith has this morality stand, or their principles. The cities, municipalities, on the other hand, are there to make money. I mean, the city is not there to make money, but that's why they invest, not because they have any belief in anything other than they want to make as much money as they can for their pensioners or however. So I think there's some differences that are interesting. You talked about the morality of your group, of your people who are working for divestment, so I'm curious, just those slight differences, which don't mean anything other than you still have to keep working, and there may be different tactics you use with the cities or the colleges. But so I'm curious about where you're going. What's happening with the divestment movement in Northampton, which I understand is expanding beyond Northampton, but you can start anywhere you want.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a piece of legislation that we're working with. We're now really in the base building phase. So we've written our resolution. We know what we wanted to say. We have a few counselors that have said they're willing to support it. So we're both meeting with counselors to try and get more support on that, but also really doing a lot of outreach. And we've been tabling at the Tuesday farmers markets every week and handing out flyers and posting on social media and really starting to ramp up that public engagement piece. So we're hoping that in the next few months, we're not entirely sure what the timeline is going to look like, but we're hoping that in the next few months, we'll have a divestment resolution that is put forth, formally introduced in the Northampton City Council. So we'll be able to mobilize people to come to those meetings and speak about it. And I know, I'm quite sure, because I've seen what folks have done for the resolution for an arms embargo in Northampton that was passed a few months ago, and then the ceasefire resolution that was passed a few months back. Just the overwhelming support that folks have poured out with for our city to align with our morals and values and principles in this way. So we're, just building that base, getting people ready for when that legislation is introduced, and we'll all come out and show our support, and hopefully something will pass.
Can I pick up on a couple of things Eve was sharing? So it's interesting because I think even though we can look to other examples of what's worked in other cities or counties or other schools, it's not going to work the same every place, which is frustrating for our movement. It makes it harder to duplicate, I guess. But
where's that template?
Right. But some places choose to go after certain companies, and that may be more likely if there are direct investments rather than indirect investments. Some places, Eve mentioned Israel bonds, can really directly impact Israel through Israel bonds rather than through these other companies. And then there's these other sort of categories. Are we talking about weapons manufacturers or companies profiting from apartheid and occupation? And there's different approaches, because companies, if you focus on the company, might change their practices. Maybe down the road they wouldn't be as bad. But we still want the municipality or the school, whatever it is, to have an investment policy that makes sure no new companies come in to the investment portfolio that would violate those certain principles. So one approach has been to encourage places to adopt new investment policy statements. And that's the kind of thing that could be excluding weapons manufacturers or fossil fuel companies rather than naming individual companies. So that's one thing I've found to be very interesting about how different places approach this divestment question.
And I'll just say one more thing, too, is that I think the hope with the Northampton campaign in particular is that things will kind of snowball out. And as Joe said, part of the real benefits of passing divestment is that it creates ripe terrain for other places to follow that lead and continue doing the same thing. So we're hoping that, Northampton, it's this progressive town, it's passed an arms embargo resolution and a ceasefire resolution. The hope is that we can pass divestment in a place like that, and that will make conditions hopefully more better for passing divestment in other towns in Western Mass. And we actually know that there are already folks in other towns in Western Mass who are working on municipal divestment in their places. So what we saw happen with the ceasefire resolutions back last winter was Northampton passed it, and then Amherst passed it, and then East Hampton passed it, and Greenfield passed it. And it really became this beautiful chorus of all of these different towns in Western Mass saying, we need this genocide to stop. We're hoping that a similar thing can happen with divestment. And
well, you also use that other word that I want to pick up on, and that is investment. How do you persuade the, your city, your municipality, your college to invest in what?
Yes. I love this question. It's not just what we're against, but what are we for? And there's this framework I've heard recently about divest, invest, that, we have so little control, it feels like, especially right now, about where our particularly federal public funding is going. And so what spheres of influence do we have? Is it a municipality? Is it an institution we're connected with? To say that we want to put resources towards the world that we want to see. So not death and destruction, but community institutions, community development, financial institutions, cooperatives, community loan funds, credit unions, other things, vehicles like that can really directly support communities. That may be harder to do on a municipal or institutional level, but certainly individuals and retirement funds can direct their money in different ways. And the more that I think we're demanding these kinds of options from financial institutions and systems, they will need to do more to offer these kinds of pooled funds that don't include weapons manufacturers. So to go beyond what we hear, socially responsible investing, that really focuses on these categories of environmental, social, and governance criteria, but to create other options for large investors to put their money into something that isn't going to feel like a violation of our values.
You know, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about this in a while, but I was at a university, and I had a choice of how I wanted my retirement money to go, into a socially responsible or socially irresponsible. And I had a colleague who really wanted to make a lot of money, so he put his money into the socially, not irresponsible intentionally, but not socially conscious and I actually, during one period when we noticed, my stocks did better socially consciously than his did.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of those misnomers or misconceptions we have.
Definitely.
That if you put your money into Raytheon, you will make lots of money, and God knows that the stockholders of Raytheon are the people who benefit from all those contracts.
Yes.
But that's hardly a reason to invest in or to support Raytheon.
Yeah, and when you think about like what you're doing with investment, like what it means when you as an individual invest in corporations that are doing such violence, or as a city that we're invested in corporations that are doing such violence, especially when we're investing money that is supposed to be used for public resources. We're investing the pension fund, or we're investing, money from the city treasury that we need for our schools and other vital community resources. When we're invested in companies that are war-making, death-making machines, then our social services are directly dependent on whether these corporations that are, do well by making weapons and technology for military genocidal regimes to use, we are then in this very horrible extractive relationship where our well-being here in, the imperial core and the services that we vitally need are directly tied to the military-industrial complex and these war-making machines. And we need to say that actually, no, we cannot be in these extractive relationships where our well-being and the things that we all need are tied to the strength and health of these horrible corporations. We're actually all mutually connected. All of our struggles are connected. We will not have our funds be invested, and we will not hinge our well-being or try to make more and more money off of genocide and violence and oppression and apartheid. And I think that that relationship that our just capitalistic structure of investment creates is something that principally is so important to disrupt.
Yeah. So let's go shift a little bit to one of our local corporations. Now we know that in every congressional district in the country there are arms manufacturers. I mean, someday, and maybe somebody has written in Watchers, if you know who's written how they nefariously managed to get this to happen, that in every congressional district there is, in fact, in the beginning, when I first started doing this research during the Vietnam War, there was one congressional district that didn't, but that changed. So we've got these war machines in every congressional district, and of course, so often, because jobs are so important, it's the jobs that people care about. So we know that if we could divest and invest, you would still have jobs. You would have perhaps more jobs, paying just as well, and making something that you don't have to be ashamed of making.
Yeah.
If you still have a conscience. Yes. So that's something else. But okay, so here we are in Northampton, and you've got this L3 Harris.
Yes, we do.
You want to talk a little about that?
Yeah, so L3 Harris is a weapons manufacturer. They're located right at 50 Prince Street, just behind Smith College. Somehow, at once, this large, very commanding presence of a factory, and also very hidden. They intentionally don't want people in progressive Northampton to know that we have a weapons manufacturer right in our backyard. But we do. L3 Harris is a multinational weapons corporation that makes just all kinds of abhorrent technology. They make parts for bombs that are used in Palestine and against other people in the global south. They make a lot of the technology, the surveillance technologies that's used in checkpoints in Palestine and also on the U.S.-Mexico border, the technology that allows ICE and Customs and Border Patrol to, track people's cell phones and where immigrants are. That's made by L3 Harris. We just learned that this airplane, luxury jet that Trump got from Qatar is being retrofitted to fit U.S. military standards by L3 Harris, and they make parts that are crucial in nuclear weapons launching missiles. And in the case of our particular branch, they make periscopes and optical technology largely for naval submarines, which may seem like, that's not the worst of what a weapons manufacturer could be doing. But these periscopes that they're making for submarines are actually crucial in the technology that would be needed to launch a nuclear weapon from a submarine, which is, I hear, the most preferred, if we could even say that, way for the defense industry to launch a nuclear weapon should that happen. So we, right here in Northampton, are making crucial machinery for nuclear arms. We know that these periscopes have been used in Israel and Palestine. And we know that Northampton has given tax breaks to L3 Harris. There was a TIF agreement between the city and what was at the time Cole Morgan, which was a much smaller defense technology company that then merged and became L3 Harris, part of this multinational killing machine. They had an agreement where Northampton was like, okay, we'll give you tax breaks if you're gonna build this factory here, you're gonna bring jobs, whatever. Which means that our tax dollars, money that could have gone to the schools, which are deeply in crisis right now, or other needed services to help unhoused people, or so many other things that we can envision, have gone to allowing this weapons manufacturer to be right here. And that's really tied to divestment, both because that is a case where we can, divest in this weapons manufacturer and invest in other places, but also because L3 Harris is on the divestment list that American Friends Service Committee has created of the companies that are most deeply involved in this. And so we see the divestment resolution, which would say that we need to divest from L3 Harris as a really crucial step in getting the L3 Harris branch out of our city.
Now, an argument would be, but wait a minute, don't they pay taxes to the city? Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, they pay taxes to the city. Not an incredible amount. We know that they've gotten tax breaks, and we know that we could have another kind of business there. It's a big factory. They could make anything that's not weapons to kill people. So I think it's really important to use our imaginations to envision, what else could this space be? What other kinds of things could we produce that are life-affirming technologies, that are things that can benefit humanity? And at a certain point, we have to say, okay, maybe they're paying tax dollars, but it's actually really important because of our principles and values that we're not making money off of killing.
Yeah, I'm curious about that because you mentioned earlier that they got tax incentives to be there, to be up on one of the prime pieces of real estate in the city of Northampton. Cole Morgan was right on King Street. And of course, as you noted, it was a local weapons manufacturer. They made periscopes then, but now it's moved to this prime location, and they got tax breaks. And I'm just curious. I hadn't even thought of it before, about how many breaks they get. What are the tax breaks, and what is the actual tax they pay, and how does that balance out? And I don't know if you have an answer to that, or if it's just a curiosity.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure the exact numbers. I mean, I have to imagine realistically that the taxes they've paid to the city have probably been more than the breaks that they've gotten. Like, I'm sure Northampton has made substantial tax revenue from L3 Harris, and I think it's, it goes back to the question of, at a certain point, we have to say that people, children in the global south, children in Palestine, children immigrant children who are crossing the border, they matter just as much as children in Northampton, and so we cannot be in this colonial extractive relationship where the well-being of kids and people in Northampton is directly dependent on the killing and oppression and violence of people in the global south, and that we can reimagine these extractive dynamics.
Yeah. So you're doing really it's amazing work. I'm really impressed with the research you all have done, and with the organizing you're doing to really come together to bring a really solid resolution before the city. And so that's one dimension of the divestment. What's happening at the college level?
We have really relied on a lot of the research that the students did. They were able to identify the holdings within that exchange-traded fund, includes L3 Harris, and some other, you mentioned Raytheon, now RTX is also one of the holdings. So some of like the big names are part of that, but we haven't really done a lot more research besides what the students have done. And one of the pieces of advice that I really appreciated from the American Friends Service Committee was to not feel like we have to do too much of the research, to put the responsibility back on the board, and for them to work with their financial advisors to figure out how can they meet this demand. Yes. They have a committee on responsible investing that's an advisory committee, so they can make a recommendation to update their investment policy. And we don't need to worry too much about the details of the percentages in this company or that company. We just need them to say that they're going to have a different approach moving forward.
Yeah. Well, and to have that investment advisor, again, is a really important thing to say. We don't want you to be financially negligent. We want to have an endowment, so that, I was impressed with the number of Smith students who get scholarship funds. And so I think there's been some really responsible investment, and then there's this little irresponsible investment.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned before about choosing a SRI kind of fund, and the framework that we think about these financial decisions is this sort of risk and return. What's my return going to be? And even thinking about the taxes, and I think you put it so well, what is at risk is people's lives, and whose lives? The people who are most vulnerable. We're talking about the military and the climate impact of military activities. Who's going to be most affected by that? Who's going to be most affected by these surveillance technologies and incarcerated or deported? So we need to start thinking about risk and return in very different ways, not just the financial dollars.
And I think I want to underscore that, because right now it seems like our country has lost its moorings. That the notion of morality, I heard recently that the notion of empathy is too feminine, and it's not what this country is all about. And the aspersions on humanity, basically. And so I think however we tip the balance to look at what is moral behavior, what are moral investments, that it's really important to raise those, because otherwise they get so marginalized, they're not even part of the discourse. Mm-hmm. And that's a real tragedy, because we become just what, I mean, I don't want to insult barbarians, you know, worse than barbarians.
I think you're right, and I think that's where we really need to push the financial institutions to do better and have better options for us, so that, you know, there can be a return to provide scholarship funds in the case of a college endowment. I just learned about a new tool that I'm really excited about. It's called movemoneyforfreedom.org. The 4 is the number 4. And it's a way...
Wait, say that again for our viewers.
Movemoneyforfreedom.org. Uh-huh. And it's a tool that actually builds, I think, on the AFSC research that they've done about these different companies that are complicit in genocide and apartheid and occupation, to help people think through the process, whether it's personal, whether it's with colleagues at a job looking at a retirement account, whether it's municipal campaign or institutional, to really find out what options they have, and then to push for change. Yeah. So I'm excited. It just released last week, but I'm excited to see what the potential of something like that is to make it easier for people to think about alternatives and access the information. Yes.
So, you know, you also mentioned, thank you, that's really important, these vehicles for people to, well, I can think, oh, I'd like to invest in something that's not a war machine, but where do I go and how do I do that? And, you know, so when you've got these different think tanks or websites even that can help you do that, I think it's really important. I'm curious, because we were talking earlier about the organizations that have a morality or a position of justice, and that leads me to the co-op, and the struggle with the River Valley Co-op, and how in principle you would say this is not what they should be investing in, and in practice, that's where, as they say, the rubber hits the road. And so I'm curious about whether you and the divestment people are working on that, or is that somebody else's purview entirely?
Yeah, I mean, we're really excited to think about, you know, an ecosystem of divestment in the valley. Some folks I know are working on apartheid-free communities to say that, you know, as citizens of this place, as people, members of the co-op, members of this organization or that organization, and residents of a city, that we collectively in all of our institutions and all of the places that we frequent should be bringing about groups and organizations and communities that are not invested in apartheid and don't support it. So we definitely see our efforts as shared and part of working to build that collective power towards a really strong divestment movement.
I mean, there are places that are pretty neutral, and then there are those that, hospitals, for example, or schools, that have in their explicit being goodness and care and all those things that we appreciate in life. So it's interesting to hold those institutions to accountability. I mean, art galleries, for example, are another one, or even good coffee shops. You know.
Yeah, we want everyone to do better, and everyone to do everything they can in whatever their sphere of influence is. And I don't know if you got to talk about BDS, Boycott, Divest, Sanctions, as a movement, but I think one thing that's so powerful about that and the sort of economic pressure that we can bring to bear is that it combines these sort of divestment campaigns that we've been talking about with something that's more on the consumer side, like a boycott. And so how do those different tactics come together to collectively send a message?
Yeah, and what's cool about BDS and why, something like the co-op can happen and something like the municipal divestment and something like the university divestment can happen is because BDS offers us these different scales where we can boycott. That's something as an individual we can do, and we can make choices about what we're buying or what we're spending our money on. As somebody part of an institution or part of a local government, we can divest and we can pressure these institutions to divest. And then as somebody that's part of a nation, a state, the United States government, we can work for sanctions on that level. So there's multiple scales that we can be working through. And I just want to uplift the 3 demands of BDS because that's really central.
Okay, so let's remind our viewers. BDS is boycott,
which is some individual, your consumer choices. Divestment, which is something that an institution can do with their stocks and bonds and financial holdings. And then sanctions, which is something that a government does. You can, a country can put sanctions on another company. So we have heard. Yeah, and the BDS movement, which is a call from widespread consensus of Palestinian civil society, hundreds of Palestinian groups who've come together in 2005, put out this call for international solidarity through taking these steps, boycotting, divesting, and sanctioning towards the ends of, 1, ending the occupation of Palestine in the West Bank and the Gaza and the Golan Heights, the Sinai Peninsula, full equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel, and the full right of return of all Palestinian refugees. So these are really the three guiding principles and foundational kind of bare minimum demands that we have in all of our work. And it really should, these are pretty straightforward things, that no class of people should have more rights than another. No people should be exiled from their land and not allowed to return. Nobody should be occupied or subject to apartheid conditions. And I want to be able to go to a store and be a part of an organization and be part of a government and know that these things that I'm involved with are not in favor of such atrocities that are going on. And I think that's really at the core of it all, is how can we all shed our complicity as much as possible.
And I think that's so important. And I want to just, again, underscore this, that right now the country is, as there was a Jim Hightower used to ask, where are we going and what am I doing in this handbasket? That's where we are. We're on our way, and we're all holding these invisible handbaskets. But I think it's really important to pay attention to, if you can change Smith College investment, it changes everything. And the same thing with the divestment of any of our municipalities, that we start to make the change, and then it becomes a model, and somebody at Mount Holyoke or Barnard says, oh, they could do it there. By God, if they can do it there, we can do it here. And I think that's part of what I think is so important, is to not look at any of our work as so, well, it's only this, it's only that. It is so much more than the only you could name. And I think it's so important to pay attention to that, because we can get tired of, oh, not another meeting. But as you really dedicate to working on really making a good resolution. And I just want to ask you about this, because I lived in Northampton a long time, and I used to really rather sarcastically say, we've passed so many resolutions I could wallpaper my house with it, and wonder about the difference between resolution and ordinance.
Absolutely.
And how your discussions about that have gone.
Yeah, so we had a lot of discussions about resolution, ordinance, something else, and we actually learned that the precedence of the fossil fuel divestment was that they first passed a resolution, and then the mayor passed an additional executive policy order that actually cemented that divestment resolution as binding. And that led to an amendment in Northampton's financial investment policy, where now in the handbook, because of that resolution that then became an executive policy order, that led to a change in the Northampton financial investment handbook.
So listen, I want to thank you so much. Eve and Joe, you have really illuminated this whole topic beyond my fondest dreams. and I hope our viewers have really learned a lot too. And not only learned a lot, but gotten inspired to go out and do something just like it or beyond. So thank you both so much.
Thank you so much. A joy to talk with you.